I never thought I'd own a dog. My work schedule was too erratic, my apartment too small, and, to be honest, I wasn't sure I had the patience for one. But then, one chilly Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing in a shelter, staring into the eyes of a trembling, dark-furred mutt. The woman at the shelter called him Toby. Toby was no more than 2 years old. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as if he expected something to leap out at him. When I knelt down and offered him a treat, he hesitated before inching closer, cautiously sniffing my hand. There was something about the way he moved, fearful but not aggressive, that tugged at my heartstrings. At first, I thought it was just the stress of adjusting to a new environment. He wouldn't enter certain rooms, mainly the living room. He'd pause at the threshold, his paws rooted to the ground, his body shaking. He wouldn't bark or whine, just stare into the empty space as if someone, or something, was standing there. Every time I tugged on his leash to guide him in, he'd resist, his eyes wide with fear. I started to feel a little concerned. Maybe he had some sort of trauma from a previous owner? It wasn't uncommon for shelter dogs. Still, it wasn't until the third night that I began to wonder if there was something more to it. That night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels, while Toby sat near the doorway, refusing to come any closer. But then, something strange happened. Toby, who had been curled up in a ball, suddenly shot up, his body rigid. His eyes locked onto a spot in the far corner of the room, right near the old armchair I'd inherited from my grandmother. I followed his gaze, expecting to see a bug or maybe even a mouse, but there was nothing there, just empty air. But Toby didn't stop staring. His hackles rose, his ears flattened against his head, and a low, throaty growl escaped his throat. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up and walked toward the corner, waving my hand through the air as if to prove to both of us that nothing was there. "Come on, Toby," I muttered nervously. "There's nothing here." But his growling only grew louder, and then, to my shock, he let out a sharp, terrified yelp before bolting from the room altogether. My heart raced. I wanted to laugh it off, but there was something deeply unsettling about his reaction. I had never seen a dog so terrified of what seemed like nothing. I tried to shake it off as an overactive imagination. Dogs can be weird sometimes, right? But over the next few days, Toby's behavior only became stranger. He refused to enter the living room altogether, skirting around the edges like it was a dangerous place. Whenever he came near the threshold, he'd stop, his whole body tense, his eyes glued to that same corner. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing in the hallway, staring into the living room with wide, unblinking eyes. Every time I tried to bring him in, his body would freeze, and he'd back away, whimpering softly. It wasn't just the living room either. Sometimes, even when we were out on walks, Toby would suddenly stop and stare into space, his body trembling like he was seeing something I couldn't. That's when the thought first crept into my mind. Something I hadn't even considered before. What if he was seeing something? I shook my head, brushing it off. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been logical, grounded in reality. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that Toby's behavior was just a quirk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. It was just past midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the sound of soft, padded footsteps in the hallway. I got up, a little groggy, and made my way toward the door. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I saw him. Toby was standing in the living room doorway again, staring into the same corner, his body so stiff it looked like he might snap in half. But this time he wasn't growling. He was just staring, silent, still. I walked up behind him, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I called his name softly. Toby? He didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on that corner. And then, as I stood there, something strange happened. I can't fully explain it. It wasn't like I saw something exactly, but the air in the corner seemed off, like a faint shimmer, a subtle distortion, like heat rising from pavement on a summer's day. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape, a vague, human-like outline forming in the haze. It looked almost like a man, hunched over slightly, as if watching me. But as quickly as the figure appeared, it vanished into the air, dissolving into nothingness. I blinked, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to Toby, who was now whimpering softly, his eyes still fixed on that empty space. Was I going mad? Was it just my tired mind playing tricks on me? Or had I just seen what Toby had been seeing all along? I backed away slowly, my hands shaking as I picked up Toby and retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. Neither of us slept that night. Something was in my house, something I couldn't see, something Toby had been terrified of from the moment we walked through the door. And now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind too preoccupied with the strange, flickering figure I thought I'd seen. I kept telling myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination running wild because of Toby's odd behavior. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something had changed in my home, something I couldn't explain away. The thing is, I had lived in this house my entire life. It was my parents' home before they passed, and I inherited it after they were gone. It's a modest old place. Creaky wooden floors, slightly crooked doorways, the kind of house with a personality, but one that had always felt warm and welcoming. Growing up here, I'd never felt anything out of the ordinary. No strange sounds in the night, no weird feelings, nothing. Just a quiet, normal home. For over 30 years, everything had been perfectly fine. Until Toby arrived. I spent the next few days trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I went to work, met up with friends, and tried to go about my routine like normal. But every time I came home, Toby's behavior dragged me back into that sense of dread. He refused to step into the living room, still fixated on that same corner as if something invisible was standing there, watching us. I couldn't take it anymore. Something was wrong. I had to figure out what it was. One evening, I decided to do a little research on the house, just to see if I could find anything unusual about its history. Maybe there had been previous owners with strange stories, or some local folklore I hadn't heard before. I dug through old paperwork, property records, even some dusty local history books that my parents had left behind. Nothing. It was starting to feel like I was chasing shadows. That night, I decided to try something different. I wanted to test whether what I'd seen was real, or if my mind had simply played a trick on me. I stood in the living room, in front of that corner where Toby always stared, and waited. I don't know what I was expecting to happen. Maybe another shimmer, another flicker of that strange, human-like outline, but the longer I stood there, the more ridiculous I felt. Nothing happened. The air felt normal. The room was just a room. With a sigh of relief, I turned to head back to the kitchen. And then Toby barked. It was a sharp, terrified yelp that made my blood run cold. I spun around to find him standing at the edge of the living room, his eyes wide and panicked. He was staring right behind me, his body trembling. For a second, I didn't move. I was too scared to turn around, too afraid of what I might see. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed it, just for a brief moment. That same shimmer, that same vague shape, it was there, right behind me. I froze. My skin prickled with cold sweat as I felt something. An icy draft, or maybe just the weight of something watching me. But there was no sound, no movement, nothing but the sense of a presence. Just there. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, never taking my eyes off that corner. I grabbed his leash and led him outside into the yard, my hands trembling the time. What was happening in my house? What had I been living with all these years, completely unaware? It didn't make sense. I'd grown up here, and everything had always been fine. No weird sensations, no ghostly sightings, nothing. And yet now, with Toby here, it felt like something had been disturbed. Something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. I spent the next few hours sitting on the porch with Toby, trying to calm him down while I sorted through my thoughts. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive. I couldn't stop replaying the last few days in my head, trying to figure out when things had shifted, when the house had started feeling wrong. And then a memory surfaced. I was young, maybe 7 or 8, and my dad was sitting in that same old armchair reading the newspaper. I remember asking him why we never moved the chair, why it was always kept in that corner. "This chair's older than you think, kiddo. It's been in the family for generations. Your grandpa used to sit here, and his father before him. They always said this corner's got a good view of the room." At the time, it seemed like such a harmless, even sweet story. A family heirloom, passed down through generations, each owner sitting in that same corner, enjoying the view of the living room. But now, in the cold stillness of the night, it felt different, darker somehow. What if there was more to it than just a good view? What if my family had known something about that corner, something they hadn't told me? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. I decided to pay a visit to my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Harper. She was in her 70s, a kind but no-nonsense woman who had lived in the neighborhood for as long as I could remember. If anyone knew anything strange about the house, it would be her. I knocked on her door, feeling slightly ridiculous for what I was about to ask. When she opened the door, I greeted her and tried to make small talk before finally getting to the point. "Mrs. Harper," I began, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember anything unusual about my house?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she paused before answering. "Strange? No, not exactly. Though your grandfather used to talk about it." I blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" She waved me inside, motioning for me to sit down at her kitchen table. He wasn't one for stories, but once, years ago, when he'd had a little too much to drink, he told me something. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He said there was a man who used to live there, a long time ago, before your family bought the place." My stomach tightened. "What kind of man?" "A recluse," she said quietly. "His name was Daogen. Lived alone, kept to himself. Some folks said he went mad in the end. But here's the thing. When they found him, they said his body was still sitting in that old armchair, right there in the living room corner." I felt the blood drain from my face as she spoke. The same chair that now sat in my living room. The chair my father and grandfather had both cherished, the one I'd been told never to move. I could hardly believe it. "Daogen," I repeated, the name sounding foreign, heavy on my tongue. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Harper leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as if trying to remember. "Well, no one really knows for sure. People back then said he'd gone mad, locked himself away in that house for years. He didn't have any family, no visitors, nothing. One day, he just stopped coming outside altogether." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. The idea that someone had lived and died in my house in that exact spot unnerved me. "Did they ever figure out what caused it?" She shook her head slowly. "No, they didn't. But there were rumors, of course. Some said he'd been obsessed with something, something no one else could see. He used to talk about shadows in the house. Figures, whispers. People thought he was losing his mind. But after they found him, she paused, her eyes darkening with some distant memory. Well, they say there was something wrong with the room. Something off. The air felt thick, heavy, cold. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Mrs. Harper didn't strike me as the kind of person prone to exaggeration, which made her story all the more chilling. So you think? I hesitated, my voice barely above a whisper. You think Deogen's still here? Mrs. Harper's gaze softened, as though she could see the fear in my eyes. I don't know about ghosts, dear, but I do know that some places, some things carry the weight of those who came before, especially if they weren't ready to leave. Her words hung in the air like a fog, thick and unsettling. I left her house not long after, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts. On the walk home, Toby trotted nervously beside me, his eyes darting to every shadow that flickered in the fading light of dusk. I could feel the weight of the house looming in the distance as we approached it, the familiar front door suddenly looking different, less like home and more like a place filled with secrets. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Daogen. Had he really seen something in the house? Or was it just madness creeping in after years of isolation? Was there something about that chair, about that corner, that had driven him to the edge? And why, after all these years, had I never noticed anything? Until now. I tried to go to sleep, but every creak and groan of the old house made me jump. Toby refused to lie down, pacing back and forth near the bedroom door, occasionally letting out soft whines. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint sound of padded footsteps in the hallway. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. Toby was already standing at the door, his ears perked, body tense. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, as if someone were slowly, carefully pushing it open, the bedroom door creaked ajar. I stared, wide-eyed, at the darkened hallway beyond, my pulse quickening. Toby let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the doorway. I couldn't see anything. The hallway was empty, just shadows and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. But Toby saw something. He was certain of it. I grabbed my phone, fumbling for the flashlight, and shone it into the hallway. Nothing. Just the same old creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. But Toby didn't relax. He stood rigid, his growl growing deeper, more insistent. I didn't know what else to do. I stood up and edged my way into the hallway, shining the flashlight around as if it would somehow reveal what Toby was so afraid of. But it was just the same old house, the same old hallway. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't loud, just a soft, raspy murmur, like someone struggling to breathe, came from the living room. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear it again. Another whisper, closer this time, almost like someone was standing just out of sight, speaking under their breath. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, I walked toward the living room, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Toby stayed behind me, his growl steady, his eyes wide. As I approached the living room, I could feel the temperature drop. The air became heavy, thick, just like Mrs. Harper had described. There was something wrong with the room, something off. I shone the flashlight into the corner by the old armchair. And there, in the faint beam of light, I saw it. A shape, barely visible, like a wisp of smoke or fog, hovering in the air. It was the same outline I had seen before, vague, human-like, hunched over slightly, as though it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, its presence suffocating, filling the room with a cold dread I couldn't shake. And then, for the first time, I heard it clearly. A voice, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Leave." The voice was rough, gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but I didn't need light to know what was there. Deogen. I grabbed Toby and bolted for the door, not stopping until we were outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I could hear my own ragged breaths, feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the house. Something that had been there long before me, long before my family. Deogen's presence wasn't just a ghost story, not just some forgotten legend. He was real, and he was still here. As I stood on the porch, staring at the darkened windows of my childhood home, I realized the truth. I had never lived in this house alone. I had been sharing it with him my entire life. The cold air outside did little to calm my racing heart. Toby pressed against my leg, trembling, his eyes still fixed on the house as if it were something alive, something dangerous. I stood there on the porch, gasping for breath, unable to fully grasp what had just happened inside. My childhood home, the place I had lived for over 30 years, no longer felt like home. Felt foreign, haunted. Deogen's voice still echoed in my ears, that raspy whisper, "Leave." But where would I go? This was my house, my life. I couldn't just abandon it because of what? A ghost? A memory? I rubbed my face with shaking hands, trying to pull myself together. Maybe I was going mad. Maybe this was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But then I looked down at Toby, still shaking, still staring at the door, and I knew. Whatever was in that house, it was real. I didn't go back inside that night. I thought about Deogen, about the man who had lived here, lost in his own isolation. Had he been driven mad by whatever lurked in the shadows of this house? Or had he, like me, spent years living alongside something he didn't understand, something he could never quite see? And then, when it became too much, had it taken him? The thought haunted me. By the time the sun rose, I was more exhausted than ever, but the daylight brought some measure of comfort. The house looked normal again in the soft morning light, its old wooden frame creaking gently as if nothing had happened. I stood up, groaning from the stiffness in my back, and slowly made my way inside. Toby hesitated at the door, his body tense, his ears flat against his head. He clearly didn't want to go back in. But I had to. I couldn't keep avoiding it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room looked exactly as I had left it. Dim morning light filtering through the curtains. The old armchair still sitting in the corner, silent and unmoving. There was no sign of the strange figure, no whispering voice, just the heavy stillness of an empty room. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever I had seen last night was gone. But even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. The air still felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was watching me. For the next few days, I tried to get back to normal. I went to work, took Toby for long walks, and avoided the living room as much as possible. But every time I was home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There were moments late at night when I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, like a shadow darting across the room. And Toby would still stop and stare at that corner by the armchair, his body trembling, his eyes wide with fear. I needed answers. I needed to know what I was dealing with. One afternoon, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. Mrs. Harper had mentioned rumors, but I needed something more concrete. I went to the local library, hoping to find any record of Deogen or the house's previous owners. Maybe there was something that could explain all of this. Something that would make sense of the strange events that had started to unravel my life. After hours of searching through old newspapers and public records, I found it. An article dated over a century ago, buried deep in the archives. Local man found dead in home. Daogen Wells, age 56, discovered in living room chair. My breath caught in my throat as I read the brief report. According to the article, Daogen had been found by a neighbor after weeks of no contact. He had died in his chair, apparently of natural causes, though the coroner had noted an unusual expression on his face, something between fear and resignation. The article also mentioned that the house had been in the Wells family for generations, passed down from father to son, and that it was the site of several unexplained deaths, including Daogen's father and grandfather. It wasn't just Daogen. The house had a history. I dug further, finding older records that spoke of strange occurrences tied to the property. Mysterious illnesses, people going mad, whispers of curses. The Wells family, it seemed, had always been plagued by something dark, something unseen. And now that legacy had passed to me. The thought made my skin crawl. I returned home that evening feeling more unsettled than ever. The house seemed to loom larger as I approached, its windows dark and watchful. Toby, who had been calmer during our outing, tensed up the moment we reached the front steps, refusing to enter the house. I didn't blame him. That night, the whispers returned. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Faint at first, just a soft murmuring in the distance, like the wind through the trees. But as I lay there, it grew louder, closer. Words I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was clear, angry, frustrated. And then, just as I was about to sit up, I heard it again, clear as day. "Why won't you leave?" I shot up in bed, my heart racing. Toby was already standing at the door, his fur bristling, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be in the middle of summer. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, my hands shaking, and shone it toward the door. The figure was there, standing in the doorway. Not just a shimmer this time. It was more solid, more defined. A man, hunched and thin, his face obscured by shadow, but his eyes were sharp, piercing through the darkness. "Leave." The word came out like a command, echoing through the room, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't just some lingering ghost. This was Daogen. He was still here, still bound to this house, still alive in some twisted way. And he wanted me out. Toby barked, snapping me out of my paralysis. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over myself as I backed away from the figure. But it didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Why are you still here? What do you want?" For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the figure began to dissolve, fading back into the shadows, but not before I heard one last, chilling whisper. "You're in my chair." I stood there, shaking, as the room fell silent again. Toby pressed against my leg, whimpering softly. I knew then that this wasn't just a haunting. Daogen wasn't simply a ghost trapped in the house. He was still attached to something here, something that had kept him bound to this world. And somehow that chair, that old worn armchair, was the key. Whatever had happened to him, whatever dark force had taken hold of the Wells family, it was tied to that corner of the living room, to that cursed chair. I knew what I had to do. As much as I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, something in me refused to abandon it. This was my home, the place where I had grown up, and no ghost, no matter how terrifying, was going to take it from me. But I also understood now that Daogen was not just a restless spirit. He was tied to the house, to the chair. That night, I waited until the house was completely still. The usual creaks and groans of the old wooden floors seemed louder than ever, and Toby wouldn't leave my side, his trembling growing worse as the hours dragged on. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the house itself knew what was coming. I stood in the living room, staring at the old armchair. It looked so innocent now, just a worn piece of furniture, but I could feel the weight of history behind it. The whispers of the past seemed to hum in the air, and every shadow in the room felt alive, like it was watching me. The chair was a tether, a link between this world and whatever dark force had claimed Daogen's life, and the lives of his ancestors before him. Toby sat at my feet, his body tense, his eyes locked on the corner. I reached down and gave him a reassuring pat, though my own hands were shaking. I didn't know exactly what I was about to do, but I had a feeling that once I started, there was no turning back. I grabbed the chair and dragged it toward the center of the room. It was heavier than I expected, almost like something, or someone, was resisting me, but I managed to pull it free from the corner. For a moment, I stood there, breathing hard, staring down at it. This was where it had all happened. Daogen had died here, his father before him, his grandfather. They had all succumbed to something tied to this spot, this cursed chair. I wasn't going to be next. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out a box of matches. My hands shook as I struck one, the tiny flame flickering in the dim light of the living room. I hesitated for a moment, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. Burning the chair felt like a final act, a way to break the hold this place had over me. But what if it made things worse? What if it only angered whatever was tied to it? But I couldn't live like this. I couldn't let Daogen's spirit, or whatever was left of him, continue haunting me. With a deep breath, I lowered the match to the fabric of the chair. The flame caught quickly, and within seconds, the dry, brittle fabric began to burn. The fire spread rapidly, licking up the sides of the chair, its glow casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. Toby barked, stepping back nervously as the fire roared to life. The heat was intense, but I didn't move. I stood there, watching as the flames consumed the chair, the wood crackling and splitting under the heat. And then, something strange happened. The air in the room shifted. It felt as though the temperature dropped several degrees, the heat from the fire suddenly overshadowed by an intense, bone-chilling cold. I could feel it pressing in on me, like an invisible weight bearing down on my chest. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, and in the center of it all, just beyond the fire, I saw him. Daogen. He stood there, his figure barely visible through the haze of smoke and flame, but his eyes, those cold, sharp eyes, were fixed on me. For a brief moment, fear gripped me. What if this was a mistake? What if burning the chair only made things worse, only strengthened whatever hold he had on the house? But then, something changed. The fire reached the heart of the chair, the wood collapsing in on itself with a loud crack. Daogen's figure seemed to flicker, like a weak signal on an old television screen. He took a step forward, then another, but with each step, his form grew more translucent, less solid. He was fading. The flames grew higher, hotter, and with them, Daogen's presence began to dissolve, his shape dissipating into the thick, smoky air. His eyes locked onto mine one last time, and in that brief moment, I thought I saw something else in them. Not anger, not rage, but something closer to relief. Then, with a final, whispered breath, he was gone. The room fell silent. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the charred remains of the chair, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. The oppressive weight that had filled the house for days, maybe for years, was gone. The air felt lighter, clearer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe freely again. It was over. Whatever had held Deogen to this house, to that chair, was gone.